You found the skeleton. How would you tell people that? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. We're continuing to look at Robert Carter telling us he's found one of evolution's weaknesses, or something. Before we get into it, please do remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. Anyway, take it away, Bobby.
There's too much noise in the system.
You got a citation for that? Because it's odd that no one who does this for a living who hasn't already decided to not take the evidence seriously seems to have come to that conclusion.
Back in Grandpa's day, the car, when you turn the radio on, you had these buttons that you'd push, and this little thing would move and try to catch the signal. And then when you kind of caught it, you take your dial and you go, because they didn't have this thing called digital yet. It was all analog.
Yeah, that's why we say you tune into a radio station, because you had to tune the receiver to the right frequency with a knob or a dial. Which is also why radio hosts sometimes tell you not to touch that dial. Hooray for words!
And sometimes you get a station, and you'd be like, and oh, that's my favorite song. You'd be like, it's, and then every once in a while you catch a word or two. What's the problem with this? There's too much noise. You weren't close enough to the radio station to get a good signal. And you know what? Even if you knew what song was being played, if there's too much noise, you would never hear it. You could listen to it for 1,000,000 years, and you would never hear your song if there's too much noise.
Well, natural selection isn't a receiver attempting to decode a signal, so this is a bad analogy. And you should feel bad about it. Natural selection is simply the observation that if a particular genotype results in a phenotype that causes organisms with it to, on average, have more offspring who themselves survive to reproduce than other organisms, then over time that genotype will come to predominate, and eventually fix in a population.
Darwin didn't understand that.
Well, he didn't understand radios, that's true, but he probably would have looked at you like an idiot if you had told him that natural selection was a receiver for a signal, so I don't know what to tell you.
He said, give me millions of years and nature will sort the noise out and that trait will naturally rise up, but it doesn't happen.
It manifestly does. We can see it now and in the lab, like when a new parasite entered the Hawaiian Islands that tracked crickets by sound. Different populations of crickets became silent as the parasitic flies spread. And the different populations used different genetic mechanisms to do it, so it wasn't simply a pre-programmed adaptation. Or the whole point of the long-term Lenski-Escherichia coli experiment is to show that the effects of natural selection and the importance of contingency on it. And we've seen lots of adaptations and increases in fitness, or we can see it in modern works on the beaks of Darwin's finches, that have also responded to climate cycles via natural selection. You can make whatever arguments you want against the sky being blue, but everyone can just step outside on a clear day and take a look themselves.
Plus, natural selection is not evolution.
Correct in the same way that a wing isn't an airplane. It's a big part of it, though.
People were writing about natural selection a long time before Charles Darwin wrote about it.
Were any of them the prophet of science? No, they weren't. Okay then, who cares?
This man is named Edward Blythe. Now, I don't think he was a young earth creationist, if you would, but he was definitely a special creationist. He definitely believed that God created the universe and created life. He wrote several papers, which I've read, they are brilliant, in 1835. Charles Darwin was born, he was in his 20s when these were written. In fact, Charles Darwin was on the Beagle going around the world as a young man when this man wrote Natural Selection, the whole thing.
Dude, you need to get to a point that matters to science. This is history, and don't get me wrong, as a guy with a history degree, I find that personally interesting, but nothing about it is going to change modern science.
But in his model, natural selection was the thing that God used to purify species and get rid of the weak and get rid of the lame and keep things from going extinct.
Sounds like that's right up your alley, so what's the problem?
Darwin said, oh no, natural selection is that thing that evolves species.
Oh, you're gonna lie about Darwin again like you did last time. He didn't say that it was sufficient on its own, it also required inheritance of new variations. His problem was that neither he nor anyone else at the time knew how new traits and variations came about.
So the idea wasn't Darwin's.
It's almost like who came up with an idea first ultimately doesn't matter in science.
Let me give you an example of natural selection. This is from Evolution's Achilles heels. Let's see if my video works here. Yeah, oh, there it is, okay. We got two bacteria. We got a mutant one on the right here. It's kind of shriveled up. He's got a little teeny pore and an antibiotic. That purple thing can't get in. Some of the food can't get in. But the normal bacteria, the food gets in and the antibiotic gets in. Oh, who dies in that situation?
The normal or wild-type bacterium. But good to know that you do think natural selection works. Not sure why you spent so much time trying to say it didn't. Just checking again. Let me know if it's massive and inexcusable incompetence or just normal old dishonesty.
The degenerate one lives? Yeah.
It's almost like the fitness value of traits is dependent on the environment, which, has been a big theme in evolutionary biology since the beginning and isn't news to anyone in the field.
Most every example of natural selection that we've seen in the world, in the laboratory, in the natural world, is natural selection acting on something that's broken.
Sure, ice fish have antifreeze because of broken blood proteins. Humans can walk upright in part thanks to broken tail genes. Tetrapods have limbs because of broken fin genes. Humans have big brains because of broken tumor suppressor genes. Elephants have tusks because of broken incisor genes. So what? But also, this is simply not true in all cases. For example, at all levels of taxonomy, organisms have orphan genes, genes which were not inherited from ancestors before the common ancestors of the other organisms with the orphan gene in the question. That means these genes are de novo and did not break anything else. So even though most organisms can be assessed as a, quote, broken version of something else, if you want to act like an idiot, it's still not true broadly. In fact, in a couple specific examples of the CYT+ line of E. coli in the Lenski experiment, they duplicated both an enzymatic section and an aerobic promoter region without breaking anything else to allow them to aerobically metabolize citrate. Similarly, in lactose-tolerant humans, lactase persistence is due to a strengthening of the function of the lactase promoter region. Nothing broke.
Let's see. A lot of you cannot digest lactose. That is the normal state. The closer your ancestors were either to Eastern Africa or Scandinavia, the more likely you are able to digest lactose as an adult.
Neat. I just use this as an example.
I can't. I'm not a mutant. There's a gene that, because lactose is in mother's milk.
Hence the name from Latin lac, genitive form lactis, meaning milk, and the ending ose, meaning sugar, so the sugar of milk. John, if you're watching this and you know who you are, it's logical, probable, and plausible that you've gotten this wrong in the past. So maybe fix yourself so you sound less like a dummy next time you're asked about ribose.
And as an adult, you don't need it anymore. So, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, that gene switches off. There's an off switch. But in some people, the switch is broken.
Wrong. Once again, Dr. Carter, I would like you to clarify if you just don't know any better because you're incompetent and can't do your job properly, or if you're just a liar. I wonder how many more times I'll have to ask that. Probably a lot. There is no switch that turns off lactase. Instead, what actually happens is that the lactase promoter is relatively weak in most humans, meaning that while it is still active in life, it competes with much more strongly promoted genes in the digestive tract, meaning that late in life, if lactase is made at all, it is not in sufficient amounts to digest lactose late in life. Lactase persistence actually strengthens the promotion of lactase, more than doubling it, allowing it to successfully compete for transcription and production late in life. This isn't exactly a new or controversial finding. This has been known for almost 20 years. So, Dr. Carter, did you just forget to actually read up on this and then just pretend that since you had already made a false claim that all of evolution is breaking things, that this would just fit your assertion? If so, I applaud you for making a prediction, but you have to check on those. Or did you actually look into it, realize it didn't fit with your ideas, and then just decide to lie about it? Neither is a good look, but there aren't that many other options.
And what does that do? It allows you to eat a nutritious, fatty, protein-rich food called cow's milk.
Well, that, but also lots of other milks are consumed by humans, including goat, sheep, camel, yak, reindeer, and horse.
As adults, and it's really good for you in some ways, if otherwise you would be starving.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of how food works. It's really good for you if you otherwise wouldn't have it.
But that doesn't help. Here's another example. Sickle cell anemia is endemic in Central Africa. Sickle cell anemia is a paralyzing, horrible, no good, bad, terrible disease.
If you're homozygous for it, sure.
It hurts to have sickle cell anemia because under low oxygen conditions, the hemoglobin in your blood cells forms crystals. And those crystals They get like lodged in your joints and stuff. And it's just, you actually usually die pretty young if you've got sickle cell anemia. But if you're just a carrier.
There's no such thing as a carrier for sickle cell. You're either homozygous or heterozygous. Sickle cell is a codominant trait. Only recessive traits have carriers, that is, people with the allele but who are not affected by it. Because it's codominant with one sickle cell allele and one normal allele, you have an intermediate genotype with normal blood cell shapes but odd hemoglobin. But it's not odd enough that it usually causes early mortality.
You're still not as healthy as normal people, but your blood's still sickle, and they tear apart the malaria parasites that live inside red blood cells.
Dude, stop making stuff up. That's not even something I can find proposed. Sickle-shaped blood cells aren't actually sickles. They're not chopping up malaria parasites. Also, if you only have sickle cell trait, your cell shapes are normal anyway. Where did you even get that idea? The actual mechanism isn't known, but one of the current best hypotheses is that the parasite has a harder time attaching to the cell membrane of sickle-affected blood cells, so it has a harder time eating, meaning that it can't make you as sick, so your immune system has time to clear the infection before you die because your symptoms are weaker. Another well-supported idea is that the hemoglobin forms complexes that trap the parasite, to the same basic effect. And it's not like getting this right would have weakened anything about your point. You just chose to go with something so inane that, as near as I can tell, no one has ever proposed it. The cells aren't actually sickle-shaped in heterozygous people. Maybe you didn't mean that, but it sure sounds like it.
So if you carry that trait, you're much more likely to survive to adulthood and have babies.
Yep, within the context of a high prevalence of malaria, it's a pretty big advantage, and we see that it has spread through much of the population. Almost like natural selection works. Which, remember, you seemed to think it didn't earlier. Thanks for contradicting your previous self from this very talk.
And yet it stinks to have it.
Evolution doesn't care about your happiness.
But you know what? If you got a choice of having malaria or being in pain, which one is better?
I can't answer that for other people, but I can say that in terms of natural selection, sickle trait is going to leave people with more offspring. But also, let's talk about the fact that we're talking about sickle cell trait, not sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is what you have if you are homozygous for sickle cell. Those are the ones who typically don't live long enough to reproduce anyway. If you have sickle cell trait, that is, you only have one sickle cell allele, then you generally don't have any symptoms at all. So we negate basically everything about this, other than the bare fact that sickle cell trait causes malaria resistance, wrong.
Being in pain. As far as, because evolution, okay, I should have said this earlier. Do you all understand that evolution has nothing to do with survival?
Well, you have to survive long enough to reproduce, so it has something to do with it.
I've actually been using natural selection incorrectly here. I meant to explain it a little better.
And there's our first glimmer of self-awareness.
Natural selection has nothing to do with life or death. Natural selection is all about having babies.
Well, that's why real scientists talk about differential reproductive success and reproductive fitness.
You don't have to live or die. You could just have more than the other person.
Fun fact, you have to be alive to make new babies.
Example, imagine that there's a mountain, and the mountain is covered with oak trees. And it's really dry at the top of the mountain. At the base of the mountain, there's a river. So the ground down here is wet, and the ground up here is really parched all the time. And within this oak tree species, there's a diversity of genes. Some of the genes help the oak tree like dry conditions, and some of the genes help oak trees tolerate wet roots. Fair enough?
No, because how the heck did the oak tree get whole new genes? You're the anti-evolutionist. Surely what you mean is alleles. But of course, if that's what you meant, why wouldn't you say it? Dr. Carter, biologist.
Now, give yourself several hundred years. Generation after generation after generation of oak trees.
Okay.
Which oak tree is going to produce more acorns on the top of the hill? The one that likes wet roots or dry roots?
Once again, ceteris paribus, dry roots. But based on how this went last time, I'm expecting you to immediately invalidate your own hypothetical because you've so far displayed the intellectual honesty of a Hovind.
The one that likes dry roots. Generations later, which genes are going to be better represented up there?
Alleles, but it'll be alleles that provide advantages in dry conditions.
The genes that like dry roots. In fact, over time, the genes are going to sort themselves on the slope. It has nothing to do with death.
Does that have something to do with life, though? The oldest trees will start to die off. Oak trees aren't immortal last time I checked.
Natural selection is a really, really bad term. First of all, nature doesn't select.
Whoa, you figured out that the term anthropomorphizes nature. Gold star! That's some 5th grade reading skills you get right there, little Bobby. Well done.
Nature's not alive.
The living parts of it are.
What's another term you've heard?
Subduction.
Survival of the fittest. That's also a really bad term, because who's the fittest?
It's a bad term, and it was invented not to describe biological evolution, but the social theory inspired by it, social Darwinism. And fitness is measured by reproductive success, usually grandchildren who survive to reproduce, which yes makes the term tautological, which is why it's a bad term that neither I nor the biologists I know use.
Is it the biggest, the strongest, the fastest?
It's context dependent. In some cases yes, in others no. But it's always the ones with the most long-term reproductive success.
The one with the best eyesight? No, it's the one who has the most number of children.
Correct. That's another gold star.
You know, World War I was fought on Darwinian terms. Did you know that?
Not only did I not know that, I think it's impossible to know that, because I'm pretty confident it's nonsense.
The powers that be wanted their armies to fight, to get rid of all the weaklings.
Yeah, I'm sure a complex web of secret alliances had nothing to do with it. And even if it had been the whole motive of the war to weed out weaklings, we're back to social Darwinism, not evolutionary biology.
So their race would be stronger. Did you realize that? World War II, that's exactly what the Germans were doing. World War II in Germany wasn't just about getting rid of Jewish people. It was getting rid of the weak Germans so the Germans would be stronger.
Oh, so now we're just going into World War II with no segue? I guess that and the First World War were basically the same conflict, and the Roma, and any resident people of African descent. It was getting rid of a lot of people. But here's the thing, the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party thought that his own, quote, race was superior, and his eugenics didn't need Darwin when it had the example of selective breeding of domesticated animals, which long predates Darwin. But even if we grant that he got every last idea from Darwin, what's your point? Argument from consequences is a fallacy for a reason. If someone tells you your house is on fire, saying, that can't be true, my family is in there, doesn't somehow make your house not on fire. So even if belief in evolution were the sole cause of all the bad things from the 20th century until the end of time, that wouldn't make it wrong. Also, of course, we have the ever-present appeal to the NSDAP. Guess what? The leader of that movement also liked dogs, being a vegetarian, and he hated smoking. So if you agree with him on those, then you're evil too. Except, no, that's not how that works. Things aren't evil by association with evil regimes, and they're not good by having been opposed by them. Unless, of course, you, as a Christian, Dr. Carter, would like to just embrace subjective and relative morality. I'd love to hear your reasoning on that.
It is nothing, it's really, I just use a life and death example again. It's not life and death. It's he who has the most number of children wins.
Basically, but we've already made this point, and no one that I know of is disputing it, so let's move on.
Oh, that's oh man, I'm going to jump to the morality section here. I skip everything here. I'm not going to finish my talk. I'm just going to have to end at the end. Whatever, it's fun. Margaret Sanger.
Founder of Planned Parenthood, and yes, a eugenicist who wanted to largely get rid of non-white people, and yes, strategically tried to make it easier for them to get abortions in the hopes of reducing the relative abundance of their genetics in the USA. Still just an argument from consequences.
My dear friend, Dr. John Sanford, he came up with an idea. It's an idea called genetic entropy. What is entropy?
Entropy is a statistical phenomenon in which, over time, isolated systems tend to have the same or less energy in the system available to do work. It is also the fact that, over time, the macrostates of a system tend to adopt forms that can be achieved by ever larger numbers of quantum microstates. It is measured in joules per Kelvin.
It's the idea that all things are decaying over time, right? Well,
no, it's not, and I suspect that you know that because I seriously doubt that you managed to get a PhD in marine biology while being that stupid. But once again, if I'm wrong about that, and instead of just being a massive liar, you are stupid, Dr. Carter, please contact me and let me know. You can just send an email as simple as, Dear Mr. Dinosaur, I am in fact a complete idiot, yours, Dr. Carter. At that point, I will keep dishonesty and malice off the table when discussing your work in the future.
The DNA, the genome, it's part of life, right? It should be decaying also.
Except it isn't. We can confirm this with paleogenomics as well as laboratory experiments. There is no actual evidence of genetic entropy outside the minds of creationists and the computer programs they designed specifically to show that it's totally real, you guys.
But see, natural selection is supposed to get rid of all those mutations, all that decay, and amplify the good stuff, and the species are supposed to go upward over time. But what if they didn't? What if they went downward over time?
they'd go extinct, which can happen in small populations. It's called an extinction vortex, and it's actually kind of the opposite of genetic entropy. So it doesn't help much, but let's talk about it anyway. Genetic entropy is the idea that some mutations are harmful, but only slightly, to the point that they are not actually going to be selected against, and therefore will persist in a population. Eventually, as the population continues to exist, the buildup of these nearly neutral but harmful mutations causes the overall fitness of the population to decline until it is driven to extinction. So this requires a lot of mutation and hence lots of genetic diversity. Now, this is stupid for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is that we can't observe it anywhere. But also, just in terms of basic math. Because these mutations are by definition increasing genetic diversity, the population undergoing this process must be internally diverse, meaning that only some individuals will go above this fitness decline threshold, where they no longer are fit enough to survive and reproduce. But the other portions of the population will survive. Also, since all point mutations are in fact reversible, it is mathematically impossible to accumulate harmful mutations indefinitely. At some point, the chances of having a back mutation to the less harmful allele will equal the chance of further harmful mutations, meaning that a population will reach an equilibrium. Last, the whole thing relies on an internal misuse of the work of pioneering Japanese geneticist Moto Kimura, who invented the field of neutral theory, which focuses on tracing evolution through mutations that have no effect on selection. In his work, he said that because any beneficial mutations would be so strongly selected for that it would overwhelm his statistics, he was going to pretend that they didn't exist. Sanford thought he could then just pretend that means that Moto Kimura was ignoring them because they largely didn't exist. That's just a lie. Sanford is either lying about having read Kimura's work, or he's lying about what that work says. Or I guess he has the intelligence of a recently stepped on sea cucumber. So what is an extinction vortex? Well, it's a result of a decline in diversity. If a population is very small, or if it is very low in diversity, it can be difficult to avoid new members of the population being homozygous for genetic diseases, and to avoid the fixation of harmful alleles simply due to genetic drift before selection can weed them out. As a result, these populations are vulnerable to both genetic diseases and opportunistic pathogen diseases, and are likely to go extinct. So for example, if you have a population of mammals that only numbers a few dozen, chances are good that they may be subject to an extinction vortex, no matter how well a hypothetical breeding program for them goes.
What if they got worse over time? This idea called genetic entropy, that even given a Darwinist all the natural selection they want, it doesn't work. And here's why. If you're born without a head, you're not going to have any children.
Tell that to all the Nidarians.
What if you're born blue?
Depends on the environment.
Marry a blind person. Right? I mean, think of all the different things you could be born with and you're still perfectly able to have babies.
Okay, so the only place this is going in my brain is places that would risk the monetization of this video, so I'll just shut up.
Despite the fact that natural selection might get rid of the worst mutations, even the not so bad mutations, the not so bad mutations can't be seen by natural selection.
They can if they have a net negative effect on reproductive success. It's not a binary you're selected for or against, and you either have or don't have offspring. If being blue makes it so that on average blue individuals have 3.2 children, but non-blue individuals have on average 3.6 children, then guess what? Blue is being selected against as long as the environmental conditions causing that persist. And the minute a genome crosses over into less fit relative to the environment than others, it will be selected against while the others are not.
Because natural selection, as I said earlier, only deals with how many children you have. If the mutation doesn't affect procreation, it has nothing to do with evolution.
This remains both true and not helpful to your case.
And most mutations are so weak that natural selection can't see them.
In fact, most of them are completely neutral.
The signal is not strong enough to rise above the noise.
Oh, we're back to the bad analogy of natural selection being a radio antenna. It's still bad.
Let me show you a chart. This is from a paper that John Sanford and I published in 2012 in an evolutionary journal. Don't let anyone ever tell you that creationists can't publish, because we certainly do. They don't like us, but...
Creationists do indeed publish. It's just that when they do, one of two things happen. It's a bad paper that makes no impact other than people pointing out the problems, or it's entirely conventional and in no way helps out creationism. Spoilers, this one is of the first kind.
We were looking around for a system where we could study genetic entropy. We've had 10 years before this. We had 10 years of theory, of math, and computer modeling. And all of it pointed to genetic entropy being real.
Wait, You mean that the computer models that you created specifically with your bad assumptions like objective fitness, the possibility of indefinite deleterious mutations, etc., then show that your bad assumptions led to your dumb conclusion? Wow, that's so surprising.
But we needed to study it in life. The problem is you need something with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of generations and data. And you can't do it for humans because, we've got maybe 1,000 human genomes today, but they don't go back very far.
Well, unless you count those genomes from the ancient humans that go back farther than you think the Earth has existed and don't provide any support for genetic entropy. Whoops.
But what we found was the flu. Somebody dug up a body of a woman that was buried in Alaska in 1917. And it was so far north, they basically hacked a hole in the permafrost and covered her.
Okay, isn't that the start to a horror movie? Do people not watch horror movies anymore?
And her body had been frozen since 1917. And I said, oh, look at that. So they took a tissue biopsy and they found the influenza that killed her, and they sequenced the genome of the 1917 flu that killed more people than died in World War I.
A worse pandemic than the most recent one, and one in which mask mandates were in effect. Now I want to give you and your organization, Creation Ministries International, credit. You guys were staunchly pro-mask and pro-vaccine, and you took a lot of flack for it from your audience. But you guys stuck to your guns. I really hope, and I think it more likely than not, that at least some of your followers got vaccinated and wore masks when otherwise they would not have, and that saved their lives. But on the other hand, you guys had to fend off a lot of anti-science nut jobs who were your followers and who were appalled that you would be in favor of the vaccine and masks. And you guys just kept protesting that you were following the science. Now, what is it about your organization that would attract anti-science conspiracy theorists, do you suppose? Could it be that for you to be right, science would have to be both wrong about nearly everything, and there would have to be a massive conspiracy to hide that fact?
At the end of World War I, basically both armies stopped fighting because everybody was sick. You can't fight in the army if all your guys are laying on the ground and doing flu things. It's terrible stuff. But we had a 0 point, the initial outbreak of this influenza.
For genetic entropy to be true, shouldn't you need a perfect genome? So I guess sometime before 1917, God came down to create the perfect screw you to humanity virus and then let it decay away from there? Look, if that's the theology you want to go with, then have fun with it. But otherwise, that virus had to have evolved from previous viruses. So why did they manage to avoid genetic entropy and make this, according to you, super virus?
And then we found all of these other sequences from the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s all the way up to the year 2009. And we said, wait a minute, this is 2012. How come there aren't any sequences of this flu in 2010 and 11 and 12?
They are. You included them in your paper.
The answer is, it went extinct.
No, you didn't. You yourself said so in figures 2 and 3.
Actually, it went extinct twice. It went extinct in 1957 the first time.
You can't really go extinct twice. If you're extinct, you're pretty well gone.
And then in 1976, on the Chinese side of the Manchurian border, it broke out again. But the flu that broke out was identical to flus that were circulating in Scandinavia in 1952. And then later on, someone in Moscow admitted that they opened up an old sample and the flu got out.
So not extinct. Extinct in the wild. Those aren't the same.
But why did it appear in China? Good question. Anyway, it's not biowarfare. They would never do something like that.
Sure they would. But is there evidence they did? Because this isn't sufficient on its own. There are valid research reasons to keep samples of old viruses that aren't biological warfare.
But that's the blue dots. The red dots are 1976 and beyond. And essentially what we discovered was that more than 10% of the DNA of the flu had mutated. But wait a second, the flu is under natural selection. You see, if you had the flu, the only flu viruses you can pass to that guy are the ones that have escaped your immune system. That's called natural selection.
He can be taught.
If you can't reproduce in someone else, you're dead. So only the biggest, strongest, and fastest flu viruses should be passed on, right? Oh, no. Because most of those mutations have nothing to do with the flu grabbing onto that little thing on your cell that it uses to get into the cell. It's like rust on a car. Eventually, every car you're driving today will fall apart to pieces. but a single little speck of rust doesn't do anything.
Cool, so you must have either measured fitness directly with things like eruption time or number of viral particles at eruption, or use a proxy like R0. Oh, no, you didn't? You used how often the virus used the same codon and sequences in its genome, and how sick it makes people. Neither of which come even close to approximating fitness. So we can't even say on the basis of your paper that fitness declined, no matter how many metaphors you make.
Millions of specks of rust send it to the junkyard. And basically, mutation in the genome is essentially things rusting out, one little thing at a time, and natural selection can't stop it. A car analogy, it would be like, oh, my tires are worn out. I'm going to slap new tires on my car. I'm going to give myself a tune-up, change the oil.
Those are important aspects of automotive care, yes.
That's what natural selection might, because if you don't change your oil, your car is going to poop out pretty quickly, right? If you don't put new tires in your car, what, are you going to get 100,000 miles if you're really, really lucky? If you don't hit any nails? But point is, natural selection doesn't work.
I'm going to need to see more than the paper in which you got wrong whether a virus went extinct, after not actually bothering to measure its fitness. Oh, and using the wrong reference genome. Because you did that, too.
Species go extinct anyway.
Okay, so let's look at Drosophila melanogaster, which is a common laboratory model organism. It's a fruit fly. It has a mutation rate of about 3 2/3 times slower than humans, but we'll call it 4 times slower than humans. That's generous to the creationists. It has a generation time of about 10 days, as opposed to the human generation time of, on the low end, about 20 years. So, 800 times faster. That means in the time it takes for a human being to be born and then go on to reproduce at a lower than normal age, fruit flies will have gone through 800 generations. And that's on the low end. But given the lower mutation rate, which, all things being equal, should lower the estimate, and being extremely generous, D. melanogaster should be experiencing genetic entropy about 200 times faster than humans. So let's presume, again to be nice, that they and the humans both started with pristine genomes after your fake flood there, Robert. So that means that in the 4,400 years that humans have been decaying away, fruit flies should have had the equivalent of 880,000 years of genetic entropy. Now, you might know if you ever left some fruit out accidentally and went on vacation, fruit flies are doing pretty well in the modern world, but warnings about genetic entropy are often couched in terms of the imminent doom of the human species. But judging by how the fruit flies are doing, which is just fine with no observable problems of genetic entropy, it seems like humans don't have to worry at any time in the foreseeable future, because apparently genetic entropy is so slow that it just doesn't happen in any measurable way, even in rapidly reproducing groups. And you know what we do when we can't measure something at all in science? We just ignore it, because it doesn't exist, or it doesn't matter. I think you can guess which one. No, I'll just tell you, it doesn't exist. And with that, we're going to wrap it up this time. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, please hit like, and tell me why you liked it in the comments. If you didn't, then hey, hit dislike and tell me what was wrong with it in the comments too. Either way, I do hope that you subscribe, and make sure you hit the bell icon, and turn on all notifications so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Bent Hovend, Cynically Skeptic, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Patrick Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if an annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.